Hello and welcome to the Other Minds podcast. I'm Joseph Bohegan. You're listening to the music of Alexander Reinagle, performed by today's guest, Stephen Siek. Other Minds, founded in 1992 in San Francisco by Charles Amerkanian and Jim Newman, is devoted to championing the most original voices in new and experimental music. On Season 5 of the podcast, we're talking with a range of composers, performers, and authors across the field of new music, including the featured composers from the 30th Other Minds Festival, which will take place October 8th to 11th, 2026 at the Brava Theater in San Francisco. Today, I'm joined by pianist Stephen Siek. Siek served as a professor of music at Wittenberg University in Springfield, Ohio, where he taught piano, music history, American music, the aesthetics of music, and film music. He is currently director of the Emeritus College Academy for Continued Learning at Arizona State University. He has performed and lectured at piano conferences for organizations such as the Historical Keyboard Society of America and the American Liszt Society. Siek is a specialist in the keyboard music of the Federalist Era American composer Alexander Reinagle. Reinagle was born in Edinburgh and immigrated to America in 1786, first briefly to New York before settling in Philadelphia and later Baltimore, where he died in 1809. He quickly became an important figure in the musical life of Philadelphia, where he performed at the 1787 Constitutional Convention and attracted the attention of George Washington. Siek will visit the Bay Area to perform the music of this little-known early American on Monday, July 20th, 2026, the 240th anniversary of Reinagle's first performance in the United States, at Littlefield Concert Hall at Mills College at Northeastern University in Oakland. Welcome to the podcast, Stephen.
Well, thank you, sir.
So when did you first come across Alexander Reinagle's music?
During our centennial in 1976, I'm old enough to remember that centennial, the Rockefeller Foundation commissioned a lot of things, including they helped to provide the seed money for a new record label. And it's still in existence. It's called New World Records. It comes out of New York. They committed themselves to issuing tons and tons and tons of early American music, which is great because a lot of those things were just totally unavailable. People had never recorded a lot of the compositions and the composers that you began to hear on New World Records, which were being routinely recorded. They commissioned a scholar, a wonderful scholar at Dartmouth, Charles Ham, to write a textbook about American music. There had been other textbooks about American music, but Ham's was so published by Norton, I began to use it. I was asked about 10 years later to teach a course in American music at my university, and I started teaching early American. We started with the Pilgrims. Well, actually, we started with Native Americans, and we went to the Pilgrims and the Puritans. And Reinagle was in there. He's almost kind of in passing. And I thought it was fascinating. And then I discovered an excerpt from the E major sonata, which I think is one of the most fascinating pieces he wrote. The excerpt is the second movement, which is in the parallel minor. It's in E minor. And if you know Baroque French overture style, that's the one thing Reinagle wrote that is incredibly French overture. And if you double dot the rhythms, it really gets interesting. And I thought, my gosh, this is fascinating music to come out of Philadelphia in 1790. I couldn't even imagine such a thing. One thing led to another, and eventually I got hold of the scores for all the so-called Philadelphia sonatas. Then I read an article by Anne McClenny Krauss, who I got to know quite well. She wrote the liner notes for my CD. She just called it Alexander Reinagle. I thought, well, this is interesting because I know a little bit about him. You know, I hardly anything at all much, but a little bit. And I read her article, and it was just overwhelming. And I thought, I think I have to play some of this music. I was invited to play one of the sonatas, believe it or not, in New York City. Somebody had started a program, and this has all got to do with the centennial, but that stuff kept going for like a decade, at our national monuments, which had pianos. And that's a very small number, but there were two in New York. And I will tell you the two because not a lot of people know this. One of them is Teddy Roosevelt's birthplace. That's on 24th Street, I believe. And they had a fairly decent Steinway, which I believe was owned by the Roosevelt family. So it's not a young instrument, but that's fine. There's some old Steinways, which are wonderful. And I played one of the Reinagle sonatas there. The other one was at Federal Hall. That's where George Washington was first inaugurated, right on Wall Street, in the Wall Street area at least. Shortly after that time, made a tape of the C major sonata, and I sent it to New World, asking if they'd like to record it or perhaps record all of them. And they seemed interested, but they kept putting it off and putting it because you got so many things on the back burner and then they bring them to the front burner. But it might have been a couple of years before I was able to get any traction on that. Then I went with a label called Titanic, which came out of Boston, run by a gentleman named Ralph Doppmeyer. And they did superb work. The label didn't last all that many years, but when Ralph was running it, they did incredible work with earlier music and a lot of piano recordings. And I like to think we did a good job acoustically with the piano work because some of it we did on an 18.5 Clementi. We took the same repertoire, and we're kind of doing that in Oakland. I've not seen it yet, but that's my understanding. We're taking I believe it's an 1815 Clementi.
Let's listen to an excerpt of Alexander Reinagle's Sonata in E, performed by Stephen Siek, released by Titanic Records. Reinagle came from a musical family, so what do we know about how his early musical training shaped him?
I don't think we know chapter and verse. Some stories are apocryphal. There was a well-known British musician named Rayner Taylor who worked in London, who was older than Reinagle, and eventually Taylor came to America as well. In fact, there's a wonderful scholar named Victor Yellen at New York University who knew more about Taylor than anybody else, I think, and he wrote some fascinating things about Taylor. Yellen's theory, and this may be, Taylor was in his 50s. Now, that is unusual for people to decide to immigrate at that time period in their 50s and just pick up and leave everything they're doing in London and come to Philadelphia, which he did do. Yellen thinks he fell in love. The singer's name, I'm trying to remember her first name. People always they were always billed on the marquee as Mrs. So-and-so or Miss So-and-so. Well, this was Miss Huntley. He fell in love with Miss Huntley, who was a soprano. She was much younger than Taylor, and maybe he gave her some instruction. He gave her some lessons, and I can well believe that. And he followed her over, and that's how he got to this country. Reinagle did not come because of him, but as Anne points out in her article, we believe that Reinagle actually studied with Taylor or learned some things from Taylor. Almost certainly he studied somewhat in Edinburgh. Probably the earliest keyboard lessons he had my guess would be somewhere in Edinburgh. I couldn't tell you with whom. His father, I believe, was a cellist. I'm almost certain that his father was a cellist, and one of his brothers was a cellist.
Were there many European composers moving to the United States in these years following the country's independence?
There are a whole community of them, and sometimes they are classified as a group. They're called, there's two groups that you hear about, and this term I can't take credit for. One of the earliest really outstanding textbooks on American music was written by a scholar at the University of Oklahoma named Gilbert Chase. And he came up with this term. He said you can look at American music right around the time of the Revolution and shortly after the Revolution and put everything in two categories. You have gentlemen amateurs. Well, who were the gentlemen amateurs? Thomas Jefferson, very much interested in music. Benjamin Franklin. Benjamin Franklin invented the glass harmonica, which fascinated even Mozart, and he wrote a string quartet. But it's a little amateurish, I think one could argue. But that's one category. William Billings, really a great composer, is strictly choral. He writes only choral music, and of course he's Boston-centered. But he has almost no training that we can. If he had training, we have no idea where he got it because he was a leather tanner. He had a day job. And a lot of the so-called Yankee tunesmiths in Boston some of them were wonderful composers, but they all had day jobs. Then there's a whole other group, and they're called, as Chase defines them, immigrant professionals. If you were a professional and you were trained professionally, almost certainly you were an immigrant because there was no place to be trained in this country at that time period. Not consistently. You might have had a few lessons from somebody. True story. The Puritans were not really opposed to music. A lot of the Puritans, even from the earliest days, are known to have owned harpsichords, cellos. Maybe they even played them pretty well. There's no real surviving record of how well they played them. However, there was no organ in a New England church until about maybe 1720, 1725. And they'd been here for some time at that time. But they had to bring in somebody from London to play it. There was nobody in all of New England who they felt, well, maybe the guy could play a chord or something, but, simply could not play the organ suitably for a service. So it was a real, if you're talking about training, how could somebody be trained? And you came in after the Revolution. There's a lot of reasons for that. A few people came before, but very few. And they didn't thrive. And of course, when the war came along, it impaired their ability to thrive far more. Reinagle got here in 1786, which got him here in time to play at the Constitutional Convention 2 years later. And that's where Washington first heard him. He probably outclassed all the piano talent in this country at the time, almost certainly, I would think.
Reinagle also seemed to be somewhat of an entrepreneur in all the different things that he did to make money. Could you talk about that?
Yeah, Reinagle did not come here to play the piano or to teach piano lessons because nobody did. Well, I won't say nobody, but no one with much sense would have done that. The thing that employed musicians, the livelihood of musicians, if you were talking about a sustainable livelihood, was theater. There were a lot of theater companies. The most famous theater company, I'll give you a good example of what it means to be a Tory and why that may not be a good idea. There was a famous family, I guess they owned theaters, but it was an acting company. Now in London, all of the major theater companies are managed by actors. The actors manage the company, they control the company, and when people go to plays, they don't go because they want to see the play, they go to see that actor. And that was just accepted. It's still accepted. The Hallam family had been here for quite some time before the war, and they were doing pretty well. They called themselves the American Company. Father, brother, and son. And finally, the father and the brother either passed on or retired. And then Louis, the son, took over. And he is now the manager of the company. And he's a Tory. Then the war breaks out. And a lot of the actors, most of the actors are Tories. They're all English. Everybody's English, obviously. And they hid out in Jamaica. When they came back, do you know there were other people calling themselves the American Company? They were most upset. So they've changed their name to the Old American Company. He's now the Old American Company, and Reinagle comes to New York to work with the Old Americans. That's why he's here, because musical theater is just as important as Shakespeare or the straight plays they would have been doing. By the time Reinagle got here, Hallam has a new partner. His cousin is a man named Thomas Wignall, and Wignall is a comedian. And not just a comedian, but as he'll have you know, he's the best comedian in the world. He keeps telling you so. And they're cousins. But it turns out, as things progress, they're not getting along. And the scuttlebutt, the story, one of the reasons is that Hallam refuses to give Wignall top billing. You know, actors often argue about billing. I've heard this. I know that's just a nasty rumor, but sometimes they might. And Wignall is upset. So Wignall is approached. I don't know how much he's proactive in this or how much these people find him. There are some very wealthy men in Philadelphia. Why don't you leave New York and come down here to Philadelphia? We're not only going to invite you to manage your own company, we're going to build a theater for you. But we're not just going to build you a theater. They call it the eighth wonder of the world. And it's SAT 2000. It's at the corner of 4th and Chestnut Streets in Philadelphia. We'll just call it the New Theater, which is what they call it. And it's supposed to open in the fall of 1793. The only problem is there's a yellow fever epidemic that makes COVID look like a picnic. I mean, it's so bad, they're piling bodies up on the street. They don't even have a place or time to bury them. Congress has to leave Philadelphia. They go off to convene elsewhere. Washington goes back to Mount Vernon. It's really bad. It's terrible. I don't want to say it does irreparable damage to the new theater. Not quite, but a lot of problems with it. Reinagle is there to be Wignall's partner. He comes in to the new theater on the ground floor because the men who are financing Wignall have said, we want music to be just as important as straight plays, as theater. We can't just have, two guys and a piano and a violin or something, and that's our orchestra. No, we need a whole orchestra. Reinagle would conduct the orchestra, and often you always have to arrange music. You've got to do that constantly. That'll be his job. We may want new stuff composed for, a play, and he has to do that too.
So is that music that he was writing for theater a big part of his existing catalog that we have access to today?
Here and there. Not as much as we would like. So much of it just wasn't preserved. Now, if you wrote a song for a singer, and for whatever reason it kind of caught on, people kind of liked it, you could buy it as sheet music pretty quickly. And that stuff, yes, that's around. Don't ask me how many separate pieces of music, a dozen at least, I would think. But entire scores, I think that would be very tricky. I've never seen an entire musical score from that period that has survived. And I think a lot of the reason for that is it would never have occurred to anybody to copy it over or to put it into print. So maybe if you found it somewhere, floating around in handwritten, manuscript or something, yeah, I guess it's always possible. When I did my dissertation, I had to do a lot of it in Philadelphia. And there were so many organizations that were so helpful to me. One was the Philadelphia Historical Society. There were many others, but one that I cannot discount is the public library in Philadelphia. It's simply called the Free Library, started by Benjamin Franklin, in case you didn't know. But the Free Library of Philadelphia. I asked for Reinagle. They brought me stuff in shoeboxes. After I don't know how many centuries, they're understaffed.
You mentioned this a bit earlier, but you'll be performing some of Reinagle's music on a predecessor of the modern piano. Would you talk about what the difference is between this instrument that you'll be performing on and what people think of as a piano today?
Forte pianos, of course, have sort of come into their own as a special subcategory, I think, of serious pianism, because you can go, depends on where you go, which institution you go to. But Cornell is one. You can get a degree there in forte piano. Malcolm Binns has been the very great forte pianist there for many years. You can go to Oberlin now, I believe, and get a degree in forte piano. That doesn't need have an extremely specific definition, but usually we're talking about a piano built somewhere before 1840. So you're playing a piano that might have been used by Beethoven or earlier. Later than Beethoven, then we're probably into just pianos. We're talking about a greatly reduced compass. In other words, the modern piano has 88 keys. Well, with a forte piano, look for maybe 54 keys, something like that. And because of that, the sound is quieter. In fact, the Clementi that we'll hear, I haven't heard this particular Clementi, but the one on the recording can sound a little bit guitar-like. It's not quite the same as a harpsichord. Harpsichord is different yet. For one thing, the forte piano will tend to sustain notes a little longer than a harpsichord. Harpsichords won't sustain notes at all.
And does the forte piano have hammers like a modern piano does?
The inventor of the piano was Bartolomeo de Cristofori, and he worked in Naples. He was an Italian harpsichord maker. He wanted to build a harpsichord that could make dynamic changes, which harpsichords can't do. He devised a piano that did not have jacks, which is what harpsichords have. They have jacks, which often can be made of wood. They don't have to be made of wood, but they usually are. And inside the jack is a little window. It's actually called a tongue. The tongue swings back and forth. And the tongue has a plectrum on it, like a guitar pick. And you push the key down, and the plectrum plucks the string. And it has a guitar-like sound. He knew that wouldn't work. The reason it wouldn't work is the moment you put the key down, the jack flies up on its own, and the performer has no contact with it anymore. So it wouldn't matter if you controlled the speed of the key or not. It doesn't matter, because it's like throwing a ball. Once the ball leaves your hand, you're done with it. But he was going to have to invent the hammer, and he did. And the very earliest Cristoforis have hammers. He called it a cembalo, Italian word for keyboard instrument, cembalo with piano e forte, soft and loud. Because just by the way you put the key down, you could make a difference in volume. So yes, the very earliest pianos, that's what makes it a piano and not a harpsichord. It always has hammers.
What role did Reinagle play in popularizing the piano in favor of the harpsichord in the United States?
It's a very, very, very good question. He may not have had to, because the piano was taking over by the time Reinagle got here. Now, I'll talk about this in my lecture. If you go online and look at pictures of the Mount Vernon sitting room, you're going to see an enormous harpsichord. purchased very, very, very late in the harpsichord's tenure. George bought this harpsichord in 1793. It was made by a firm called Longman and Broadrip in London. It's a beautiful instrument. But the harpsichord was on the way out, and George didn't get that memo. Everybody else knew it was on the way out. He spent a fortune for it. He didn't play it, but his granddaughter did, and Martha did a little bit as well. But that's a one-off. Everybody else was playing the piano. Reinagle, if he came to Mount Vernon, and he might have come from time to time and gave Nellie a lesson, perhaps he did. He was forced to, use that instrument because that's the only instrument there. Incidentally, today, if you go to Mount Vernon, there's some music on the music rack on that harpsichord. And they're little teaching pieces that Reinagle wrote for Nellie. So was he actually present in Mount Vernon? Did he deal with the harpsichord? I don't know. I think very little, perhaps some. But at any rate, the piano was already a fact of life by the time Reinagle got here. Is the simplest answer I could give you.
Do you have anything else that you want to say about Reinagle or the music that you're going to play in Oakland before we finish up?
There are 4 sonatas. I only recorded 3 of them. They're very easy to remember: C major, D major, E major, and F major. They just go up like that. They don't really have any identifying characteristics other than just their keys. It's not like sonata number 1 or sonata number 2 or anything, but on some recordings, you'll see sonata number 2. And what they're talking about is we would not know about these sonatas, which I think was the greatest music composed in the 18th century in America, the greatest keyboard music, certainly. We wouldn't know about them because they were never published in Reinagle's lifetime. He didn't think there were enough people on this side of the ocean who could play them that it would make it worthwhile to publish. He's probably right. They're pretty tricky. So because of that, they just remained in possession of the family for over a century. About 1904, his great-grandson gave the manuscripts to the Library of Congress. And that's how we have them. So if you hear sonata number 1 or number 2, they seem to be positioned a certain way in the folio at the LC. The first one that's usually put there is the D major. So sometimes they call that number 1, and they call the E major, they call number 2, and the C major. Now, the F major, I didn't record because it's missing a violin part. Now, that doesn't stop some people. Say the violin part's not that important. And it has very, very nice features about it. There was only so much we could put on one CD, though, and since we were going back and forth between 2 pianos and variations and such, I thought it was probably much wiser just to leave the F major out altogether, and let's stick with things that we actually are pretty sure we have all the notes. We can play them. So, and I think it's the greatest music composed in the 18th century, certainly on American soil.
You can hear Stephen Siek perform the music of Alexander Reinagle on piano and forte piano Monday, July 20th, 2026 at Littlefield Concert Hall, Mills College at Northeastern University in Oakland. We'll be back in a few weeks with author Theodore Gordon to talk about his new book, The Composer's Black Box: Making Music in Cybernetic America. Thank you, Stephen, for joining me today, and thanks everyone for listening.
My pleasure.
This has been an episode of the Other Minds podcast, brought to you by Other Minds. Our 30th festival is October 8th to 11th, 2026 at the Bravo Theater in San Francisco.